Sit here, Charles. Just give everyone a chance to sit down. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Margaret Thatcher. I'm the chairman of the Centre for Policy Studies. There is a very distinguished guest list here tonight, and I'd like to say thank you all very much indeed for coming this evening. This is the second year of the Margaret Thatcher lecture, which the CPS inaugurated. The inaugural lecture was given by Rupert Murdoch, and in a moment I'm going to introduce you to our great speaker this evening. I'd like you to know that our speaker of this lecture has very kindly agreed to repeat the lecture in Washington in March, which we've never done before and which we're delighted about. I'm very grateful to him for. I'm very happy to say that I have a message for you all from Margaret Thatcher. She sends you all her very best wishes, and she says in particular that she knows, as she knows obviously the speaker very well, that you will have a perceptive and stimulating analysis of British politics, as indeed we will. I wonder if you would, before we go much further, would you all join me in sending Lady Thatcher the very good wishes for her good health and long life from everyone here this evening? I'd like to thank the people at Bloomberg who have laid all this on for us, in particular Sharon Bowen, who's organised things at the Bloomberg end. I'd like to pay particular thanks to Julian Seymour, who is here and is the chairman of the Thatcher Foundation and a great friend of the CPS, and to Mark Worthington, Mrs. Thatcher's chief of staff, who looks after her very well indeed. In the audience is Lord Vinson, one of the great founders of the CPS and a great friend of ours, and I'm delighted to see him here. I want particularly, as I must and mean most sincerely, to thank Jenny Nicholson, our secretary, who organises everything for the CPS so brilliantly, and our superb director, Tim Knox. Perhaps you'd join me. Charles Moore is Lady Thatcher's official biographer, as you all know. He's also a great and old friend of the CPS. He wrote his first pamphlet for the CPS in 1991. And like all friends of the CPS, having become a CPS pamphleteer, things then went very well for him. And he became, as you all know, editor of the Sunday Telegraph and the Daily Telegraph, and became, as you see today, a man who, unlike perhaps most normal commentators in the press and in the media, of whom people are aware, but when Charles writes, everyone takes notice from number 10 downwards. And it's a great honour, Charles, that you've come to do this lecture for us tonight. Thank you very much. The subject of Charles's lecture this evening is going to be the third rail of British politics, which you touch it and die. It's called Europe, and we're going to hear that in a minute. Would you allow me to take a second to put this lecture series in Margaret Thatcher's name into a context for you, if I may? At the CPS, we want everyone to be happy, and scientific research shows that human beings are happier if they have something to believe in, as we do and as Mrs. Thatcher did. Round at the CPS, we do not have stars in our eyes, looking for the promised land or the new Jerusalem, nor is our head in the clouds, searching for the end of the rainbow. Our feet are firmly on the ground at the CPS, but it's just not necessarily the centre ground. And when it isn't, our aim, achieved in the past, is to move the centre ground to where we're standing, which is free markets, a small state, low tax, independence, individuality, and self-determination. Where do all these ideas come from? You can find them all, dear friends of the CPS, in the Penguin book of the great speeches of the 20th century. Because in there you will find Margaret Thatcher's first speech to a party conference, her party conference, as leader of the party. It's entitled, "Let Me Give You My Vision." And so she did. It's a masterpiece. I strongly recommend it. Charles will be very familiar with it. Soon after that speech, she founded the CPS with Keith Joseph, as you all know, and developed the winning arguments of our time. And she put them so simply. A rising tide lifts all ships. If you want a bigger slice of cake, the best thing to do is bake a bigger cake. Then everyone gets a bigger slice. Caring that works costs cash. As she said, the story of the Good Samaritan shows that first you have to have the money in order to do the good works. And that lower tax is good for moral reasons because it means more freedom for individuals, and for economic reasons because, ironically, as she said, lower tax rates lead to higher tax revenues in the long run. So round at the CPS, we like Margaret Thatcher's ideas very much. We like also her attitude. Isaiah Berlin wrote a famous text on the great man theory of history to try to analyze whether there is indeed such a person, or whether the great man theory of history works. And he writes there that to deserve that title means that the person who is going to claim that title must have demonstrated a flat refusal to accept the status quo and have had a romantic belief that an individual acting alone can make what seems highly improbable, in fact, happen, which is exactly what Margaret Thatcher did. So that's why we at the CPS have launched her baby, which is how we feel, have launched this lecture series in her name. And what a marvellous honour it is to introduce you to Mrs. Thatcher's, our founder's, official biographer, Charles Moore, who will give the second Thatcher lecture tonight.
Thank you very much for those kind words, Maurice. Berlin, of course, when he was writing, hadn't yet thought of the great woman theory of history, she does embody that theory. And one of the things I'll try to write about, have written about in my book, which cannot appear in her lifetime, is trying to address that particular point among many others. My title tonight is "The EU versus the Nation State: Who's Winning?" And you will note by the end of it that I haven't fully answered the question, but you will, I hope, forgive that and sort of understand as we go along. A few years ago, you did me the honour of asking me to deliver your Keith Joseph Memorial Lecture. And please don't worry if you can't remember what it was about, because I can't either. But Keith was one of the very few politicians in whose name lectures should be given, because through his courage and honesty, he succeeded in harnessing the power of ideas for the public good. And no one knows that better than you at the Centre for Policy Studies, because Keith founded it. And so this evening you do me an even greater honour by asking me to deliver the Margaret Thatcher lecture. I feel as if, having previously preached about John the Baptist, I'm now being invited to write the gospel. And it was under Keith Joseph's leadership that Margaret Thatcher, who in 1974 was the opposition spokesman on the environment, helped found the CPS. I think Maurice may have got this date slightly wrong, but I could be easily corrected, because I think she was actually helping before she became leader. I think you were already on the road. And she was shattered by the failure of the Heath government to deliver economic recovery and win the general election of February 1974. And so she cast about with characteristic energy and passion to understand why it had failed. And the answers which, with the CPS's help, she reached, changed Britain, and it's not an exaggeration to say that they changed the world. And those who worked in the CPS in 1974, and one or two are here, I think certainly Nigel Vincent, will remember that Mrs. Thatcher coming in and actually helping get the office going. And she sat on the floor and started to wire up the plugs. which in those days, due to some trade union rule, were never attached to electrical goods when you bought them in a shop. And I love this typically practical image of her, literally earthing the work in hand and physically powering up the ideas which she cared about so much. Now, I shan't call Mrs. Thatcher an intellectual because I don't want to damage the high reputation that she has with ordinary, decent British people. But she was excited by ideas and was brilliant at propagating them. And the late Alfred Sherman, who also of this organisation, was right in saying that she was a person of beliefs, which is even better in politics than a person of ideas. Those ideas and those beliefs gave her the spur for action, and the rest is history which I'm busy trying to write. As we're all sadly aware, Lady Thatcher can no longer take part in great public debates. And I find this particularly poignant at this time because the subject which arguably caused her fall from office is the great matter of the present hour. She tried to resist the process which eventually brought about European Economic and Monetary Union at the end of the 20th century. And now, in 2012, we see the crisis of the project which she opposed. And it really would be fascinating to know her reactions. Possibly they would include those rarely popular words, "I told you so." We cannot, as I say, unfortunately hear those words, but tonight I want to attempt three things. The first is to set out what Margaret Thatcher thought about Europe and the nation state and why she thought it. The second is to ask why she did not, at the time, prevail. And the third is to bring the issue forward to today. How can a modern British government learn from what she got right and what she got wrong? It's often been stated that her famous no, no, no in the House of Commons on her return from the Rome summit in October 1990 spelt the end of her premiership. But might the repetition of that one little word be more efficacious for a Conservative leader today than it was 22 years ago? Before I embark on this analysis, let me suggest that it might be helpful in listening to what follows to bear in mind the question which the Tories rashly fought and narrowly lost the general election of February 1974 over. Who governs Britain? Was what Ted Heath asked the British people, and no clear answer came back. At the time it was asked, the question referred specifically to the power of the trade unions. And in this sense, Margaret Thatcher, as Prime Minister, triumphantly answered it. But the same question, who governs Britain, asked more widely, always preoccupied her. It was central to her approach to Europe. It explains why she resisted the move from an economic community to what we now have, the European Union. So the question remains, who governs Britain? And I defy anyone to answer it with clarion confidence today. But in the end, it must be answered. Now, it's often been said that Margaret Thatcher began her political life strongly in favour of Europe and grew more and more irritated with the community while Prime Minister, and that after leaving office, she turned almost completely against it. And in terms of her stated positions, this account is true. She voted for the legislation that secured British entry to the EEC in 1972, and she campaigned for a yes vote in the referendum of 1975. And some of you may remember or have seen the photographs of her in a very striking jersey with all the flags of all the member states stuck to it, which she wore for the occasion. And even in the Bruges speech of 1988, the famous Bruges speech, she said that, quote, "Our destiny is in Europe and as part of the community." And it was only after leaving office that she expressed any public doubt about whether she should have signed the Single European Act. In the 1990s, she became privately sympathetic to the view that Britain would be better off out of the whole thing. But though this account is formally correct, I think it's also misleading, because it is clear from Mrs. Thatcher's public pronouncements on Europe throughout her career, and even clearer from her private remarks, notes and letters, that she was never a believer in the European project as conceived by its founders and expressed in the Treaty of Rome. She could, it's true, particularly in the 60s and 70s, be found arguing for the EEC in terms of freer trade and wider markets. And in the context of the Cold War, she often called for the community to speak up more unitedly in defence of the Western way of life. And this led her in her early days to favour more foreign policy coordination. She endorsed the spirit of cooperation and the practical advantages. But she never endorsed the essential doctrine. You might say that she went to church but never took communion. Thus, for example, she never supported ever closer union, which is the great phrase from the beginning, except as a vague expression of common purpose. She always publicly opposed a United States of Europe. She never favoured economic and monetary union, though she allowed herself to be persuaded to sign declarations which included EMU as an aspiration. And she always, until forbidden to do so by treaty change, insisted on calling the European Parliament by its formal legal name, the European Assembly, in order not to accord it full parliamentary status. And she refused to refer to Jacques Delors as Monsieur le Président in deference to his job as President of the Commission. She always stuck with plain Monsieur Delors. And her favourite technique when asked to agree to forms of words which advanced a European federal state or superstate was to ask what those phrases meant. And then she would argue for words that were less, quote, airy-fairy. But in reality, I don't think it was so much the airy-fairiness which she disliked, though she certainly did detest waffle. I think it was the kernel of real meaning that those words contained. Whenever she agreed to such things, as she did to mentioning EMU in the preamble to the Single European Act, it was because her officials and ministers represented to her that agreement to grand-sounding words was a price worth paying for specific material advantages. So, for example, she signed up to the solemn declaration at Stuttgart, the Solemn Declaration on European Union in 1983, because she was told it would help secure Helmut Kohl's backing for the budget deal, which she sought and largely won at the Fontainebleau summit the following year. And it was only quite late in the day that Mrs. Thatcher came to understand that these solemn declarations and communiques, preambles and treaties, though undoubtedly windy, were even more undoubtedly real. They truthfully upheld the goal of superseding the nation state. From the very beginning in the 1950s, they had been designed to create a process which would make that goal inevitable. And now she never at any point agreed with that goal. She always believed in the nation state, particularly the British nation state. And she equally disliked that rule of inevitability because it conflicted with the British constitutional doctrine that no parliament can bind its successors. And I think that helps to explain why her community partners were so angry with her in that famous row about the British contribution to the EEC budget that went on from 1979 to 1984. Because not only did they dislike the idea of the British rebate because they would lose money, but they were furious at her use of the phrase, "I want our money back." Because the sum she was talking about was the sum paid over by each member state into what was called the community's own resources. And in a deep theological sense, the other member states held that such resources belonged absolutely to the community as a sovereign entity and therefore could not be returned. So when Mrs. Thatcher demanded, quote, "our money," she was speaking to their minds not only selfishly but heretically. But of course to her they were the heretics, because how could British parliaments in perpetuity be forced to go on paying taxpayers' money and not be allowed to change their mind? Since this disagreement about the goal is absolutely basic to Britain's entire problem with Europe, and since the goal of ever closer union is central to the idea of all Euro integrationists, it might seem puzzling why it was suppressed for so long. In 1986, for example, I was editing the Spectator, and we found ourselves the only national paper, and of course we're tiny, and we were tinier then, we found ourselves the only national paper opposing the Single European Act on the grounds that it took away significant sovereign powers from the United Kingdom. Hardly any public debate took place, and in the House of Commons only a handful of Tory MPs rebelled. Everyone else accepted Mrs. Thatcher's sincere but mistaken presentation of the Act as a market measure rather than a constitutional one. In fact, it's a great irony that the only British Prime Minister who could quell British Euroscepticism was Margaret Thatcher. And you can see the extent of the change since then when you reflect that today about 80% of the national press is Eurosceptic. And the Conservative Party is now dominated, though not yet led, by people who strongly hold such views. But perhaps this reluctance to open up the real debate in the 1980s is not so hard to understand. Last week I heard the Booker Prize winner Hilary Mantel speaking about the Tudor period in which her novels were set. And she said that her task was to convey something which is not always clear from the history books. It's what she called the atmospheric pressure of the time. And the atmospheric pressure which bore down on Margaret Thatcher at the beginning of the 1980s was that the subject of Europe was settled. Only 5 years earlier, the British people had confirmed our membership in a referendum by 2-1. And most politicians were quite relieved to have this argument out of the way because of its unique ability to split their parties. In private communications, indeed, Mrs. Thatcher was always emphasising, usually to pro-European ministers who wanted to race far ahead of their backbenchers, that she had to try to hold her party together on this subject. And with the help of Bernard Ingham's simultaneously blunt and cunning presentations of her negotiations at European councils, she liked to be seen to win victories against various annoying foreigners without at the same time completely upsetting the apple cart. And as for the Foreign Office, its officials mistrusted Mrs. Thatcher's European instinct and laughed at her ignorance of foreign ways, but they also respected her skill and prestige as a tough negotiator. And she, by the way, reciprocated this respect. I think it's quite interesting. She disliked the Foreign Office in theory, but often got on well with its most able officials. They liked her energetic combat, but they also liked neutralising what they saw as her extremes. It was in their interest to play down any profound differences about the purpose of the whole enterprise. And to some extent, it was in her interest too, because any other thoughts seemed just too difficult to contemplate. So, for example, if you look at the arguments which developed about whether or not Britain should enter the exchange rate mechanism of the European monetary system, in 1985, when Nigel Lawson succeeded in lining up almost the entire government in favour of ERM entry, and Mrs. Thatcher held out against it virtually alone, the discussions had no stated European political or constitutional dimension whatever. It was all to do with what was best for the exchange rate, interest rates, and the control of inflation. And the Treasury, which of course is genuinely preoccupied with these problems, took the lead, and the Foreign Office quietly backed it up. The whole question of whether the ERM would lead to a single European currency was, of course, at the back of many minds, but it was almost literally not mentioned. So call it statecraft or call it doublethink, this way of proceeding seemed to work for a remarkably long time, and it reached its apogee in the Single European Act. And for their part, the main continental partners were also apprehensive of direct dissension. Most, though not all, had welcomed British membership of the EEC. And significant numbers of them could see some sense in Mrs. Thatcher's criticism of the way EEC spending, particularly on agriculture, actually operated. As the decade wore on, more were forced to recognise that her arguments for economic reform, visibly successful in Britain, should be applied to the community too. So talk of an improved single market was persuasive, but where they never agreed with her was in questioning the ideal of Europe itself. But for a long time, they were able to push all that to one side. And this only really changed, I think, with two factors. First, the approaching end of the Cold War, and second, the rise of Jacques Delors. Mrs. Thatcher was by far the most prescient of European leaders about the former, but was somewhat naive about the latter. It was she, just before Christmas in 1984, who had entertained Mikhail Gorbachev at Chequers. She'd spotted his potential, even though he was not yet the Soviet leader. People often forget that. He was actually only their agriculture minister at that time. And the two argued with astonishing frankness about the respective merits of their two systems. And it was something about the fact that they argued so much which established a sort of basis of trust. And from the position of military and economic strength, which, thanks to Ronald Reagan and herself, the West had recently acquired, she saw that the NATO allies could encourage real change in the Soviet bloc. So almost paradoxically, on the great question of overcoming the artificial division of Europe since 1945, the Iron Lady was more flexible than her less strongly anti-communist European allies. She quickly saw Gorbachev's potential for assisting change in the right direction. She never believed that Gorbachev was the answer, but she saw the opportunity. But she was slower, however, to see Delors' potential for change in the wrong direction. She had supported his candidacy for the Commission presidency in 1985 on the grounds which were true that he had been an able controller of the previously unruly French government finances. But by 1988, he had asserted himself. He became chairman of the committee in charge of bringing EMU into being. And when that committee reported in the following year, he made it perfectly explicit that ERM membership was indeed a mere prelude to EMU. In 1988, he told the European Parliament that in 10 years' time, 80% of financial and economic legislation would emanate from Brussels. And what it really enraged her was that in September 1988, he went to the, of course, wholly anti-Thatcher TUC and advanced his gospel of Europe's social dimension. And at last, Mrs. Thatcher had the enemy in plain view. So it's this double context of the Cold War and the rise of Delors that the Bruges speech delivered that September, shortly after the TUC performance, should be seen. She felt simultaneously very excited by what was going on in the East and maddened by the changes taking place in the West. British officials who were very agitated about the Bruges speech when they read the drafts, they've honestly admitted to me that they didn't understand the full dimensions of the speech. They were so concerned about how her words would be received in the chancelleries of the EC that they thought the passages about Eastern Europe were the boring bits. But in fact, her definition of Europe as stretching far beyond anything defined in the Treaty of Rome reads extremely well in 2012. We must never forget, she said, that east of the Iron Curtain, people have been cut off from their roots. We shall always look on Warsaw, Prague, and Budapest as great European cities. And it's partly thanks to her that they are so again today. And she also used the progress of the Cold War and of Western economic success to adopt a forward position. Quote, "The fact is that things are going our way. Freedom is on the offensive for the first time in my lifetime." The way to take advantage of this, she thought, was first to strengthen defence and second to recognise that the future of Europe lay with what she called willing and active cooperation between individual sovereign states. Specifically comparing the USSR with the European community, she said how odd it was that just as the Soviets were beginning dimly to perceive that they could not succeed unless they started to disperse power, so the EEC was becoming a, quote, appointed bureaucracy. Power centralised in Brussels is not the answer, she said. And a European currency was dangerous because, quote, you can't build on unsound foundations. Contrasting her own success at home with what was happening at the heart of the EEC, she delivered her most famous line. "We have not successfully rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain, only to see them reimposed at a European level, with a European superstate exercising a new dominance." And those words still echo today. I heard them echoed by David Cameron in the House of Commons yesterday when he used a similar formulation to talk about resisting the European increase in the European budget, and I'm sure he consciously used such a formulation. The Bruges speech was bold and visionary, and it wasn't in any sense isolationist or Little Englander, and I think it was in its essentials right. But it did something which until then even Mrs. Thatcher had not directly done. It challenged the validity of the EEC institutions and thereby questioned the great goal of the Treaty of Rome itself. By taking on the Brussels bureaucracy just as it was coming into its own, she took a stand against the whole trend of the community. And having annoyed so many European leaders for years over the budget rebate, she was not likely to persuade them when she argued that the entire project should be cut down to size. They, particularly Helmut Kohl and François Mitterrand, and of course Jacques Delors, were not disposed to take any lectures from her. They had heard plenty of them already, and they did not enjoy them. The collapse of the Soviet Empire, which began in 1989, was the fulfillment of Mrs. Thatcher's dream. But its effects on the attitudes of the European community was almost exactly the opposite of what she wanted. The first breach in the Berlin Wall occurred on the 9th of November 1989. And from that day forward, the facts on the ground started reuniting Germany before the formal political deed was done. This momentous change was in different ways terrifying for all concerned, not least, actually, for Germany itself. But it was also, in some sense at least, welcome to all concerned, except to the Soviet Union. But that did not make it much less frightening. The main fears were chaos in the East with a possible Soviet crackdown, and the rise of a mighty German nation with all that that had previously disastrously meant for the peace of Europe. But unfortunately for Mrs. Thatcher, however, all the main leaders of the West disagreed with her on the best way forward. They wanted a grand bargain by which Germany, in return for unification, would become even more European. It would promise to subsume its greatest specific post-war achievement, the Deutschmark, into a single European currency, and political union would follow. At the end of that November, Helmut Kohl told President George Bush on the telephone, quote, "I will see to it that we make progress with European Economic and Monetary Union. I think it is a great mistake on Maggie's part to think that this is a time for caution. It's an iron law," he went on, "that there will be no going alone in German policy. It's our responsibility that we are anchored in a general whole." And it was on this basis that the United States, and though he said something different to Mrs. Thatcher, François Mitterrand, supported German reunification. Self-determination was permitted, quote, "within the perspective of European integration." Mrs. Thatcher saw things differently. In his memoirs, Kohl records that he can never forget her furious remarks at the Strasbourg Economic Council of December 1989. Quote, "Twice we've beaten the Germans, and now they're here again." She warned against the dangers of a united Germany, not only in relation to stability in the Soviet Union, but as a problem for Europe in general. Early in 1990, she counselled Bush that Germany would prove to be, quote, "the Japan of Europe, but worse than Japan. Germany is in the heart of a continent of countries, most of which she has attacked and occupied. Germany has colossal wealth and trade surpluses. Its economic power would be too dominant," she said. "There should be a counterbalance to Germany, provided by strong independent nation states, not by a European superstate." Well, her view, and even more her tone, drove her to the margins of the debate. So obdurate did she appear, and so personally hostile to Germany, almost as if the Second World War was still being fought, that she lost friends. And as Britain lost ground to Germany in the councils of the United States, she became angrier still. She just seemed to be resisting the inevitable. Despite her closeness to Republican presidents, she never succeeded in alerting them to the supranational aim of the EC. They thought, in a vague, benign sort of way, that maximum Western European unity was desirable and gave little thought to the terms on which that unity was bought. And in fact, I think it's only in the last 2 years, when European integration has threatened world slump, that American policymakers have finally noticed something amiss. Perhaps Kohl was right to detect in Mrs. Thatcher a sort of jealousy of his country's success. In any event, her stance made it much easier for her European partners on the continent and her Europhile opponents within the Conservative Party to make life ever more difficult for her, and sometimes I think they did it in concert. Although her unpopularity at home related to the poll tax, not to her widely shared attitudes to Europe, it was Europe that made her the victim of the elites. Because of her way of referring everything to the war, she gave Geoffrey Howe the opportunity of accusing her, in his famous resignation statement of November 1990, of living, quote, "in a ghetto of sentimentality about our past." She seemed like a great leader whose time had gone. And perhaps in a way she was. She'd certainly been in office far longer than any other British Prime Minister in the era of universal suffrage. And I do think that her intense suspicion of German motives was unworthy. Anyone like she who believed in well-functioning nation-states should surely have welcomed the emergence of a single democratic German nation for all the perils, even despite all the perils attendant on its creation. Yet as more than 20 years have passed, it turns out that Mrs. Thatcher, despite her retrograde rhetoric, was in fact thinking ahead, because she did correctly identify the error of the argument promoted by Kohl and accepted by Mitterrand that a, quote, European Germany should be brought into being in order to ensure against a, quote, German Europe. As the European leaders gathered in Rome in October 1990 for the summit which was to be the prelude to her downfall, she had lunch with President Mitterrand at the British Embassy. And she told the President of France that the idea that a federal Europe would tie Germany down was wrong. If Germany went forward with plans to surrender national sovereignty, if Europe went forward with plans to surrender national sovereignties, particularly over currency, she said, Germany would become dominant. She predicted that the move towards a federal European superstate would be a blind alley in history, just as the creation of the Soviet Union had been. By the way, President Mitterrand affected it being lunch to agree with most of what she said, but went ahead and did the opposite. On other occasions, Mrs. Thatcher developed this point in relation to the single currency. Germany would dominate the single currency as it already dominated the ERM, she said, and was bound to try to do so in ways that reflected Germany's own needs. Once independent states, unable to set their own interest rates to reflect their own economic and financial conditions, would become satellites. With the single European currency constructed around German financial power, it scarcely mattered how European in spirit Germany might be. European countries would be forced to become German in their policies if they wanted to prosper. If they found this uncongenial or impossible, they would be subjected to a merciless squeeze. In 2012, it's surely extremely hard to deny that this is exactly what is happening. This policy, intended as a way of supplanting nation-states, has made one big, powerful nation, Germany, bigger and more powerful, and has subordinated the rest. Unlike Mrs. Thatcher, I do not personally believe that Germany tried to bring this about because of a lust for power. And in fact, I believe it regrets its dominance. But it is nevertheless what has happened. If we look at Europe today, we see Germany disliked and feared as it has not been before in my lifetime. I was born in 1956, by the way. When she talked about all of this, Mrs. Thatcher was always clear that she was not, in essence, discussing technical, monetary or economic questions, though she could hold her own far better than most politicians on such subjects. She was profoundly conscious that she was talking about that great question in any nation and in any political order, of who rules whom and by what means. Who governs Britain was the question, and indeed, who governs anywhere else? So please, could we just look again at the famous House of Commons statement on the Rome summit? We'll slightly oddly edited, but I want you to see how it sort of flows.
On economic and monetary union, I stress that we would be ready to move beyond the present position to the creation of a European monetary fund and a common community currency, which we have called a hard ecu. But we would not be prepared to agree to set a date for starting the next stage of economic and monetary union before there is any agreement on what that stage should comprise. And I again emphasize that we would not be prepared to have a single currency imposed upon us, nor to surrender the use of the pound sterling as our currency. It is our purpose to retain the power and influence of this House and not to denude it of many of the powers. I wonder what the right honourable gentleman's policy is in view of some of the things he said. Would he have agreed to a commitment to extend the community's powers to other supplementary sectors of economic integration without having any definition of what they are? Would he? because you would have thought he would from what he said. One of them was that the Commission wants to extend its powers and competence into the area of health. We said no, we weren't going to agree to those things. And what he says, he sounded as if he would, for the sake of agreeing, for the sake of being little Sir Echo and saying me too. Would he have agreed to extending qualified majority voting within the Council, to delegating implementing powers to the Commission, to a common security policy, all without any attempt to define or limit them? The answer is yes. He hasn't got a clue about the definition of some of the things he is saying, let alone securing a definition of others. Yes, the Commission does want to increase its powers. Yes, it is a non-elected body, and I do not want the Commission to increase its powers against this House. So, of course, we are differing. Of course, the chairman or the president of the Commission, Mr. Delors, said at press conference the other day that he wanted the European Parliament to be the democratic body of the community. He wanted the Commission to be the executive, and he wanted the Council of Ministers to be the Senate. No, no, no. Perhaps the Labour Party would give all those things up easily. Perhaps they would agree to a single currency, to total abolition of the pound sterling. Perhaps, being totally incompetent with monetary matters, they'd be only too delighted to hand over the full responsibility, as they did to the IMF, to a central bank. The fact is, they have no competence on money, no competence on the economy, so yes, the right honourable gentleman would be glad to hand it all over. But what is the point in trying to get elected to Parliament only to hand over your sterling and to hand over the powers of this House to Europe?
Moment, Commit!
And of course, those very words, remember, that made Geoffrey Howe resign. And I think you'll see from this that her greatest concern is who answers to whom. Just as she rejects the Delors model of European government on that basis, so she rejects the idea that the British Parliament should surrender the national currency. She was not shouting no, no, no against the emerging post-Cold War reality. She was defying the notion that a central European bureaucracy, even when aided by an enhanced central parliament, could sensibly control the affairs of a whole continent and represent the interests of hundreds of millions of people. Is there anything which has happened since to suggest that she was wrong? One must ask the same question about the single currency. Today, to greater or lesser degrees, Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Ireland and Cyprus are all acting under orders dictated by the above bureaucracy, underpinned by a German-dominated monetary policy set by central bankers, not elected politicians. Some of those countries find that a quarter of their population is now unemployed. None of them is allowed to work out a sovereign democratic remedy for these ills. In the Eurozone, the EU has defeated the nation-state, except one might say the German nation-state. It is an understatement to say that this is an enormous disaster. So the question that I want to ask by way of ending is for any British government to work out what to do about it. And I notice that creeping into this argument is a fatal conceit. There's a whole train of Eurosceptic thought which concludes that because an idea won't ultimately work, it won't happen. You may remember John Major saying, when Prime Minister, that calls for a single currency had, quote, all the potency of a rain dance. He was right that the single currency was flawed, but wrong that those who believed in it lacked the power to make the European weather. It happened, there is a single currency, and it doesn't work. Now that the euro is patently not working, the same complacency takes a different form. Look, says a certain type of Eurosceptic, it's a disaster, so that's all right then, it'll collapse. All we have to do is stay out of it. Well, again, not so. I mean, of course, we should stay out. But the inevitable Eurozone reaction to the failure of the single currency is to try to reinforce it. The Europhile answer to any European failure is always more Europe. And Europhiles are much better placed institutionally than Eurosceptics to bring what they want about. Hence the idea of a banking union and all the reforms that were discussed at the European Council last week. Last month, the Future of Europe group, which is composed of the foreign ministers of most of the Eurozone, issued a report, and it called for European governance of national budgets, the coordination of economic policy, the end of the national veto in future European treaties, the direct election of the President of the European Commission, who would then appoint members of a European government and a European army. And last week, the German Finance Minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, demanded the appointment of a European currency commissioner who could strike down national budgets that he did not like. On past form, then, it's reasonable to conclude that most of these proposals will be implemented in the next few years. More Europe is coming. And now it's encroaching on the real decisions that countries make about taxing and spending, and therefore it goes to the heart of national independence and democracy. In the face of all this, the classic British official reaction, which is even stronger than the complacent it won't work attitude I've just described, is to resort to what I might call blind pragmatism. We, the British, the line goes, are suspicious of grand schemes. We're concerned to make the European Union work better. We're not dogmatic about structures. We care only about results. We shall look at all proposals, quote, on their merits. But this approach is wholly inadequate because it fails to recognise the true nature of the EU, which is a highly ideological, almost religious organisation. The EU is dogmatic, especially about structures, and so anyone who pays no attention to the dogma puts himself in a weak position. To use a current cliché, the dogma is the elephant in the room, and if we're unaware of this, the elephant will trample us into the ground. Even when it acts disastrously, the EU is usually capable of defeating the nation state, at least in the short run. That, after all, is what it's organised to do. And the nation state is not organised to fight back. And that, in essence, is why British policy in Europe has generally failed over the past 40 years. And since Mrs. Thatcher's day, the only thing that's made any dent on the centralising life of the EU have been small attacks of democracy. I don't know if you saw the obituary last week in the Daily Telegraph of Claude Cheysson, who was France's foreign minister under Mitterrand. It quoted him as boasting in 1999 that the Europe of Maastricht only came about because of the absence of democracy. Quote, "The construction of Europe has taken place because of intergovernmental cooperation. We worked outside the normal democratic structures, and that is why we succeeded." Well, Mr. Cheysson was alarmingly frank, but surely historically correct. By the same token, it matters when democracy interposes itself against the process. So it did when Holland and France voted against the European Constitution, for example. And it made a difference when Britain insisted, under the pressure of public opinion, on an opt-out on the single currency, and made even more of a difference when the threat of Jimmy Goldsmith's referendum party forced all the main parties at the 1997 British general election to promise a referendum on any plan to enter the euro. And this almost alone has kept us out of what would probably have been the most disastrous economic decision our country would ever have made. And today, the principle of a referendum on Europe is enshrined in our law under the European Union Act, which gives the British people a final say on any change designed to transfer competence, any competence, I love that word, competence, double meaning it has, from the UK to the EU. And as we meet, the Conservatives seem to be edging towards some sort of promise at the next election of a referendum in the next Parliament over Britain's membership. And you can see how far opinion has moved by the fact that government ministers, Michael Gove only last week, can now say that we should contemplate getting out of Europe without the heavens falling in on them. If Mrs. Thatcher had said anything like Mr. Gove did, she would have been ejected from office at once. Now, of course, we should welcome all genuine attempts to give our own citizens a fuller say in the constitutional future. And at some point, there'll have to be a referendum. I would caution, though, from a Eurosceptic point of view, that it matters very much at which point. But I do regard a referendum as morally and politically essential. But you will observe that the call for a referendum comes not because we trust a Conservative government, if there were one, or a Labour government, if there were one, or the present coalition. It's because we don't. So the promise of a referendum from a mainstream political party is therefore not an emblem of its faith in the British people, but an effort to buy us off. It feels like an electoral gambit. A referendum promise is being used by government as a substitute for something that is missing. And I think what is missing is actually the same thing that was missing, oddly, in the Thatcher era. What's missing is a new policy. Because even though, as Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher dramatically changed the rhetoric and attitude towards Europe, she never felt politically strong enough to change the policy itself. This most powerful of British Prime Ministers did not command a majority in her own cabinet on this subject. So, for example, the policy all through her time was that we couldn't enter the ERM until the time was right. So all through that time, Mrs. Thatcher had to keep on pretending that the time might be right at some point, when in truth she fervently believed that it never could be. So when she finally gave in and agreed that we should join, it was not because she changed her mind, but because she'd been defeated by her colleagues. Even after the Bruges speech, which proposed such a new course for the whole of Europe and put the nation-state at its centre, there's no actual alteration in British policy. In that sense, I feel quite sympathetic to those British officials who we Eurosceptics are rude about, because the policy was always that Britain was a full-hearted member of the European community. And really, it was the same policy as that of Ted Heath, so you could argue that in upholding it, officials were only doing their job. Even today, after more than a generation of rows and after the monstrous disaster of the euro, and after the emergence, in fact, though not in name, of a two-tier Europe, the policy has trimmed a bit, but is still not fundamentally changed. And I checked this last week by ringing up the Foreign Office and asking them the bald question, what is Britain's European policy? Which is quite an amusing experience, because the polite officials I dealt with were a bit taken aback and a bit hesitant about exactly what I wanted. And after a few days' consultation, however, they don't move very fast, and I had to ring them again to remind them that I hadn't had an answer. They told me what the policy was, and you might be interested to know. Quote, "The choice between the status quo and leaving the EU completely is the wrong question," says the policy. Because, quote, "Europe is changing and we do not know how the EU will end up looking like at the end of this crisis." Well, to me, that doesn't sound like a policy. It's more like one of those bits of Foreign Office travel guidance about whether it's safe to visit a particular country. But the Foreign Office does go on to state that, quote, "Membership of the EU is in the national interest of the UK. It is central to how we create jobs, expand trade, and protect our interests around the world." So what we have is a holding operation, partly a weak rehash of a long-standing position, of the long-standing position, and partly the cautious observations of someone watching the progress of a fire on the other side of the street. There's nothing in the policy about what Britain actually wants to happen, or how the European Union should be reformed or restructured. Last week, the Home Secretary announced that Britain was temporarily, at least, opting out under Lisbon Treaty permissions of 130 Justice and Home Affairs regulations. Well, that was good news, but we were not told whether the opt-out represents a reclaiming of our national rights or merely a pause to reflect before we opt back in. So still no clear direction of policy. The one piece of the stated policy given me by the Foreign Office which does have a potential to move somewhere is the statement that, quote, "The government recently launched a review of the balance of EU competence to better understand what the EU does and its implications for our country." And such a review contains within it the chance for an enormous change in our approach. If that balance of competence is wrong, what then? Can we alter it? The EU has its famous doctrine of the acquis communautaire, which in Anglo-Saxon means what we have, we hold. We should develop a counter-doctrine of what one might call a réacquis national. What we have lost, we want back. But you cannot form such a judgment about the balance of competence without a prior belief about what should belong to the nation state. And it is this which British governments have always refused to formulate. Mrs. Thatcher did outline such a formulation at Bruges, and it persuaded the elites of Europe to sign her political death warrant. What British leaders don't understand, I think, nearly a quarter of a century later, is that their position now is much stronger than hers then. Those European elites have lost legitimacy in the intervening years. No modern European leader has the prestige of a Helmut Kohl. No Eurozone state has an enthusiastic democratic mandate for its current policy. No country can point to the EU leading it to salvation, and many in the Eurozone can see it leading them to economic hell. Every projection of economic growth or technical innovation or demographic change shows the EU in relative decline. No exterior country looking in now holds up the EU as its model. Yes, the EU has far greater powers than it had in the 1980s, but far less prestige. It's an ancien régime in a pre-revolutionary situation. So it seems very strange then that Britain, spared the worst by not being in the euro, remains so enthralled to the status quo. Our Treasury even calls for greater Eurozone economic integration while opposing treaty change. It doesn't make sense. In the old days, Irish nationalists used to love saying England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. Surely today the EU's difficulty is Britain's opportunity. When our leaders see this at last, they, unlike Mrs. Thatcher, will be able to reap the political rewards. The development of the EU, and particularly of EMU, has given us a chance to test the proposition, which one can read every day in the cleverer newspapers, that the day of the nation state is over. That proposition is failing the test. The fate of a country like Greece shows the trap. Membership of the Eurozone persuaded Greece to throw all normal financial caution to the winds. And when catastrophe ensued, membership of the Eurozone prevented Greece from doing what was needed, which was mainly a devaluation, to put things right. Of course, critics can fairly point out that Greece was the author of many of its own misfortunes. But the point about being a nation state is not that you don't make mistakes, nor that you can act without reference to exterior realities. It's that you contain within yourself the capacity and the authority to put right what you have got wrong. Almost the most frightening aspect of the whole Eurozone saga is the lack of this capacity and authority. In a democratic nation state, the voters can throw out the people who've made the mess. In an entity like the EU, the central bureaucracy imposes upon supposed democracies the representatives of its own disastrous decisions. For all their defects, nation-states can be so constituted that their governments reflect the broad wishes of their people. In other words, they can be functioning democracies. We've seen enough of the EU to learn that it cannot. And isn't that really the most serious indictment that can be levelled against it? The shape of the world today is actually being made less by blocs and more by nations than it was in the past. The United States and China, India and Brazil are nation states, and it's as such that they make their decisions and drive their economic advances. And the same is true of less powerful but stable countries like Canada and Australia. The same could easily become true once more of Great Britain. But for this to happen, it has to be sought. Instead of being vaguely in favour of parliamentary democracy, how about devising an actual policy for recreating one in the country where it began? Thank you.
Well, Mrs. Thatcher isn't prone to understatement, but when she said earlier in the message that I read out to you that we were going to be able to look forward to a stimulating and perceptive analysis, I think that is an understatement of a really most masterly description of British foreign policy and Mrs. Thatcher's policy in relation to Europe, and I congratulate you on behalf of everyone here. Charles has very kindly said that he's going to be prepared to take a few questions. So if you want to ask a question, please would you put up your hand, and if you would please stand up to ask your question and say your name, and if you represent a particular organisation, what that organisation is. Let's start here.
My name is Taylor, Cyril Taylor.
Comes a mic.
Coming.
Oh, thank you very much. In my work as the chairman of the Specialist Schools Academies Trust, I wanted to know why apprenticeships in this country were so difficult to organise, and how so many of our young people weren't learning the technical skills that they should do. But the German system with the Realschulen and the apprenticeships is working fine. I got myself invited to the federal German government education department. I was astounded to learn they have a constitutional court which gives the 16 German Länder the right to say no to any Brussels-initiated employment and health and safety rules. Why don't we have a similar constitutional court? and I entirely support your idea we should have a national referendum. Wouldn't the Norwegian situation be the best? Access to the free market, but nothing to do with their rules.
Shall I pull some questions together?
Yeah, no, whatever you wish. Do you want to take that one now, or do you want to take it?
I'll do that quickly. I think, thank you. I know nothing about the rules of apprenticeships, but you're right that the German Constitutional Court is very important, and it keeps on being appealed to in many situations right now. However, I do observe that it's actually extremely careful about what it will. It isn't the Eurosceptics' friend to the extent that the Eurosceptics think, because it's very cautious about getting into political territory. So actually, the reality in Germany is somewhat different from the stated constitutional position and somewhat less advantageous, I would say.
There's a question there, and then I'm coming over here.
Bernard.
I can see.
Bernard Herrmann. In the last part of your excellent lecture, you concentrated upon, or you rather mentioned, a series of countries that are rapidly being integrated into the global economy. However, I think you missed the proportionate changes that have taken place since 1990. With the integration of over 2 billion people into the global economy, the European Union, however much it thinks of itself as a large global power, is in fact a demographic irrelevance, with its 400, 500, 600 million people. That isn't many people anymore. Now, we talk about holding a referendum. If you have unemployment rates of 20, 25, or even 30% in some member states, it seems to me the collapse will gain a momentum of its own, and Britain may be forced unilaterally to leave the European Union. The European Union may well split into 2 or 3 separate parts. Would you care to comment upon that?
These are very important. Can I take a few more? Because I think we may come in this. This is a very big area. I think we're sort of 2 points.
Coming over here first.
You go to the China Media Center at a time when millions of Europeans are unhappy with the European Union. Do you need this? At a time when millions of Europeans are unhappy with the European Union, why do you think it is that so few European politicians of other European countries share your analysis? And why isn't there a mass movement against Brussels?
Let's do that now, Charles.
Yes. I'll see if I can, like those sort of news announcers who try to link to completely unrelated, I'll see if I can bring them together. I think one of the things that doesn't make me a complete out-and-out Euro opponent of the European Union, though I am absolutely opposed to the United States of Europe, is really the point you're making, which is that if you go to a great many European countries, a lot of people seriously believe in it, and they seriously believe in it for good reasons. Some of them seriously believe in it for bad reasons, by the way, but some for good reasons. And I suppose if you had to say what they were, they are basically fear of their own histories or of their neighbours. And, you know, those fears are justified and very understandable. It doesn't necessarily mean that the remedy is correct. But I notice now that I think this proposition is now being really tested, because I think from a pro-European point of view, absolutely fatal to introduce the single currency before you'd worked out the full political arrangements. And indeed, possibly you cannot work out those political arrangements. But because what you get is suddenly you find, when the crisis comes, that you are powerless. And your whole country, which you thought was being sort of protected by this larger institution, is actually being screwed by it. And when you get to that point, then that's what I mean by a pre-revolutionary situation. You know, what are the poor Greeks, you know, even if it's true, which I'm afraid often it is, that the Greeks fantastically mishandled their own affairs, what are they supposed to do at this point? How can they get out of this vice in which they're being put? And I think when then people really start to ask the questions. But you're quite right, they still, I mean, you see it moving fast, I think it's moving fast now, but the alternatives appear to be disaster, fascism. It's all very frightening. And I think that's the stage we're at. The question, about the demographic weakness of the European Union, I did mention it. I mean, you're absolutely right to emphasise it. I did mention it in passing. It's very marked. And to some extent, that's reflected in an economic weakness. The European Union is not the future. If you just think about what's happening in the whole world, leaving aside any debates about the structure of the European Union, it's not the future. I'm not sure I can answer your question about the related part of your question about sort of what happens if we do leave it in terms of the shape of the whole. But I think one of the paradoxes about nowadays is that, in fact, gigantism, which is one of the arguments for the European Union, that you need to be a big player in a world full of giants, is fundamentally wrong, and that since the digital revolution, there's actually not a great advantage. There's a disadvantage in many ways in being a giant. Douglas Carswell's new book's very interesting about this. He points out how prosperity is so much greater, and I think of the top 20 prosperous countries in the world, only one of them is a big one, which is the United States. So I think you're seeing everything, a structure which is invented in the middle of the 20th century as a sort of top-down, centralizing, leader-oriented, undemocratic, highly political rather than free market structure, just doesn't make sense in terms of what's happened in the world.
There were lots of hands up over here, so let's come to this side. Yes, in the second row there.
Mohammed Amin, member of that endangered species, a conservative Europhile. While none of us can predict the future, what will be your view if, say, in 5 years' time, more Europe has succeeded in integrating the Eurozone and resolving their economic problems?
It's a very fair question, and I think that ultimately, if the United States of Europe, or some such body, could be genuinely accepted by its constituent people, I think it would be very hard to argue against it. If that's what people want, it's what people want. I absolutely believe that they won't want it, because I cannot see how the European demos, can exist in foreseeable circumstances in such a way that it can be expressed in a European democracy. And therefore you will have the unanswerability, and therefore you will have the tensions, and you will have the incredible contrast between the powerful and the weak and so on. And that seems to be what is now being exacerbated. I don't have a sort of absolute belief that this is in theory wrong. The whole structure of continents changes in history. But I do have a almost absolute belief that it bloody well can't happen.
I'm going to take two questions from this side of the room again, which perhaps we'll do together in one go, Charles. So, yes, over there first. And I'm worried about Charles's time, so I'd be very grateful if you, whoever wants to ask a question now, would ask their questions as briefly as possible.
Angela Ellis-Jones, why do you think that David Cameron is so boneheadedly determined to keep Britain inside the EU, despite all the evidence of what a complete disaster it is, particularly for Britain? The fact that a majority of the general electorate are opposed to staying in, that a significant majority of Conservative voters are, and that lots of Conservatives are defecting daily to UKIP over this issue.
And at the same time, yes, over there.
Tony Amatrudo.
Would you stand up, please?
Tony Amatrudo, Middlesex University and the Max Planck Institute for Foreign and International Law. I've got just a thing that arose in my mind. You mentioned Berlin to begin with, and it just seemed to me that often Thatcher is characterised as a hedgehog, and you seem to be characterising her as a fox. So just like you to comment upon that. Thank you.
I can never remember which way around. I assume it must be that the fox is the one who has lots of ideas, and the hedgehog with one, isn't it? Yes. Oh, golly.
David Cameron, UKIP.
Yes, I mean, I think on the second question first, one thing I think is misunderstood about Mrs. Thatcher, and she deliberately makes us misunderstand it because she's always saying how she's a person of conviction. She certainly is a person of conviction, is that she's also very cunning, and that she didn't stay at the top of politics, just by having convictions. There was, so I think when one listen very carefully to her analyses and predictions, they are expressed in terms which make you think that they are sort of tremendous enunciations of principle, but they also are thoughts about what's actually likely and what's really going on. I'm not quite sure whether that makes her a fox or a hedgehog, but I think possibly a hedgehog with foxy characteristics. The question about David Cameron, I do think one must be fair about this. I think what you have to do whenever you're thinking about what politicians do, you have to put yourself in their shoes. If you're the Prime Minister of Britain, it is hellishly difficult to get out of the European Union, even if you seriously decide that you should. And of course, he hasn't seriously decided that he should, because I don't think he believes that. But even if he did believe it, I mean, what it would mean is that the whole of his term would be entirely taken up with this issue. He would even now probably split his party. He would be attacked all day and all night by the BBC. There would be terrific flurries on the markets. There could be sort of mass organised panic. As Keynes said, capital is a great coward, and you can see them all fleeing if they suddenly thought that. Now, I'm not saying in fact that all these things would happen. Ultimately, I don't believe that they would. But I think it's impossible, almost, when you're in office, if you haven't thought this out beforehand, to undertake such a great enterprise, unless there is the most fantastic crisis. And I suppose the question we're all thinking about now is that fantastic crisis upon us or nearly upon us?
We're going to the back of the stalls.
First, John Moynihan. Charles, first, congratulations on a wonderful speech. I thought it was terrific, and I agreed entirely with your sentiments about the United States of Europe. But you warned us to distinguish, in your speech, you warned us to distinguish between that which was undesirable and that which might actually happen, desirable or not. And to come back to you and offer the opposite possibility of European Union breaking up, the last couple of months have seen Germany pushed closer and closer to being required to pool its national treasure with that of other European nations, their negative national treasure in many respects. And every chance that Merkel has been given to step back from that, she has blinked. And it looks more and more as if we've got a 3, 4, 5 year breathing room in which the President of the European Central Bank has said we're going to stand behind these national bonds, and there will be a certain amount of recovery. But during that time, Germany's treasure will be committed to the rest of Europe. And if that happens, then politically everything else follows, because Germany won't do it without insisting on all these things that you talked about. And you will have a United States of Europe, and you'll have areas of great poverty in there, just like America has West Virginia or Detroit. They'll have Greece or indeed East Germany. Germany's done it once before when it pulled with East Germany and went one-to-one on the Deutsche and the Ostermark and immiserated itself as a result for a decade. So Germany blinks when it is required to act in its own interest because of war guilt or whatever. Yeah. And as a result, it may be that however undesirable the United States of Europe may be, it may well happen.
Yes, I'm not absolutely saying that will happen, but I can't disagree with you. I think it's quite likely. Yeah.
I think we're going to have time for one more question, then I'm going to exercise my right to ask the last question. So let's come here to the second row. I'm sorry, there's so many hands up, Charles, as you've seen, but I think we've got to stop.
Sure.
Apropos the question of Cameron in government, I think it should be clear, and what I'm stating is the obvious. If you win an election, you have supreme power. There are only two powers that can put the government out of Parliament. One is Parliament itself, and the other is the monarch. If you win an election, don't look at the BBC, don't look at the press, decide what you have to do and carry out your policy. You have the power to do it.
Well, in principle, I agree with you, but remember, nobody won the last election. It's an important point.
If he wins the next...
Yeah.
Very fast yes/no question.
Go on.
Win your referendum in the midst of...
Could you stand up, please?
Martin Ivey, the Sunday Times. Would you win a referendum in the midst of a domestic economic crisis?
Well, that's why I said, though I want a referendum, I think it's very important at which point and exactly why it's called.
Charles, thank you very much indeed. There were so many people who wanted to ask questions that I'm very sorry I had to stop and let Charles go. I'm going to exercise my prerogative and ask the last question. You have thrillingly described Mrs. Thatcher's views on Europe, and I think you've excited us a great deal about what your book about her whole life will do and how very brilliant it'll be. I'd like you to settle one historian's question for us, which doesn't particularly relate to Europe, but it relates. You'll understand completely. Would you say, Charles, on the basis of the work you've done on the book you're writing about Margaret Thatcher, that when historians argue, as they do already, about whether Mrs. Thatcher was or wasn't unconservative, we'd all like to hear your opinion. What I mean by that is that it is said that the true version of conservatism is pragmatism, not the kind of ideology or idealism with which one associates Mrs. Thatcher. What that means is that Edmund Burke would have been a true conservative, because he would have explained to conservatives that what we should look at is what is, not what should be. So by that definition of a true conservative, is Mrs. Thatcher a true conservative or not?
Well, I would say she is a true conservative. And some people accuse her of being a Manchester Liberal, but not so in my view, because she is basically a romantic mind, despite having a very good technical mind. And so what she's really thinking about all the time, I think, more than any sort of programmatic ideology, is this country, actually. I think what she's thinking about is the genius of Britain. And she sees that in historical, not necessarily very accurate historical terms, but very strong historical terms. And so she believes in the effect of free markets deeply, but she doesn't believe in them in a sort of mechanistic ideological way. She believes in them as part of the expression of the British character and the capacities of the British people. And that is, I think, what really sort of excites her, is some idea about what it is to be British, and that, of course, is an absolutely characteristically conservative position. Just one little thing I noticed: a school friend of hers wrote to her when she got made a Knight of the Garter, and hadn't seen her since then, and wrote to congratulate her because she called herself. She just wrote to congratulate her and said, marvellous, you're a Knight of the Garter, etc., etc. And she wrote back to her and she said,